Hello everyone, this is your host Professor Rhea here, and yes, I have a new mic. Now, I've been getting various comments throughout this time that, hey, your mic is old. And, well, technically it wasn't. It's actually a new mic. It was designed to sound like an old mic. That is specifically what it was designed for. But what I hadn't realized up until very recently, that even though it sounds really cool to me, and is actually really cool sounding in the right circumstances, using it as a general purpose mic was not necessarily the correct circumstances. You will hear me use that mic again, but that will be reserved for very specific projects where that sound makes a lot more sense. For the rest of my videos, this will be my general mic, so I will be reserving the old-timey mic for specific projects. In the meantime, now that that's all addressed, let's get back to the Cabalist, which is the Occultist Necromancer combination. Now this is a really great combination to improv, which is one of the reasons why I'm making these broad class examinations that don't deal with items. This is what you would want to be looking at to improv. Additionally, if you just want to test out the class and see where you want to maybe take it, maybe you really like a particular build style upon testing and want to work towards a set that actually does that, or accentuates that playstyle, that's also something that you can use this video for, things of that nature. But with that intent out of the way, let's get into it. Now, when you play a Cabalist, there are three broad categories of builds that you can run. You can run Vitality Focus, with differing secondary damage types. You can run a pet focus, which is fairly obvious from the amount of pets that you've got and pet support that you have in these classes. And what is not often talked about, a poison acid broad build. Now there are basically a couple of things you really want in this setup. For example, if you're running poison acid Cabalist, you want Dreek's Evil Eye. Now whether or not you use Focus to Gaze is up to you. I really like it, but it prevents you from spamming this. If you really want to just spam eyeballs everywhere, obviously don't take Focused Gaze. Obviously you also want Blood of Dreeg for the self-heal. Even if you don't necessarily go for Aspect of the Guardian, although I do recommend that, at the very least take Blood of Dreeg because that is great healing. And then on for the Necromancer, you actually really want the Summon Blight Fiend under the effects of Unstable Anomaly. Now keep in mind that Grim Tools has a slight issue where it's actually not discounting the skill recharge reduction, and the summon limit is not being increased. Notice that this says +2 summon limit, minus 10-second skill recharge. So if I removed this, 18-second skill recharge, 1 summon limit, add this, the same, just lives for 12 seconds. So Grim Tools has a mild issue here. So it's actually an 8-second skill recharge under the effects of Unstable Anomaly. But really the point of this specifically is for these zombies to draw enemy fire, because they have both of their skills generating additional threat. Now the Blight Burst also can confuse targets, but it's pretty hard for you to necessarily chain that. Having 3 of these helps, so you can theoretically chain confuse a target, at least temporarily, depending on how the Blight Fiends feel like running, but these will basically act as targets for enemies to go after, and that will take a lot of damage off of you, which gives you a surprisingly large amount of breathing room. Furthermore, because they are poison acid, they are going to benefit from Blood of Dreeg, as long as they stay within a certain distance of you. So there is also that benefit. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, that means I really want to be playing this melee, by the way, I forgot to mention, please take possession here. If you're thinking to yourself, well, that means I should really be taking melee, not necessarily. You see, if you decide to go with a ranged poison acid Cabalist, then you actually can use the Blight Fiends as a frontline, even though they only live 12 seconds. Keep in mind that they live 12 seconds, but they have an 8-second skill recharge. So you can basically spam Blight Fiends as a mobile, self-destructive meat wall that can block enemies, draw their attacks because they're generating additional threat with the Rotting Fumes aura and the Blight Burst special attack. And that way, you're actually not being targeted by anything, in most cases, anything melee. There are, of course, exceptions to this, but you can actually run these with even a ranged, and still utilize Blood of Dreeg, specifically the aspect of the Guardian, specifically for the boost to your poison, acid, and vitality damage. Now, you can additionally keep in mind that this is fairly expensive, but let's build out this all the way because I want to show you something here. And that's namely that you have all kinds of delicious options. Alright, so you've got all of this. That's delightful. Now, you'll notice you have 18 points. You can put this in a lot of different things. But personally, I either will lean towards Ravenous Earth or Bloody Pox. You don't technically need both because this is a reduction to enemy health. I usually go for Bloody Pox personally. I'm just more fond of it. And this does too. You don't necessarily need Blight Burst if you really want the extra points to go into one of these a bit more. I usually use Rotting Fumes, but you also don't have to. But just keep in mind that you do have options here. The Blight Fiends can be incredibly effective. You don't necessarily need to use the Blight Fiends either. They are basically a self-destructive meat wall that you can use, but you could also splash in Bloody Pox or Ravenous Earth instead, or use some kind of hybridized combination as you so choose. And this all comes out to be quite potentially very effective. And keep in mind that I actually didn't have the full points here. You would actually pull out 10 here, so there's actually supposed to be 10 more points than I actually showed here. So keep that in mind. Actually, let me demonstrate that really quick. So you can go here, you can go here, full. You basically are going to really want full Eye of Dreeg, because whether or not you go Focused Gaze, that is going to be your primary source of damage output. Alright? That is your #1 move. So at this point, you have these. This is for the healing and the defense, technically speaking. This is your regular, consistent poison acid damage. This is for the damage absorption and the damage boost. Now at this point, you really do technically have 3 options. We're going to pull out 10 points here. There we go. You do have 3 options, very specifically. More if you're feeling a little spicy. You can go into the Blade Fiend with Unstable Anomaly. You don't necessarily have to use Unstable Anomaly. I just find it more effective in this build because it allows you to basically see their Virulent Death means that the more often they die, the more damage they're technically doing. So by spamming large quantities of self-destructive Blight Fiends, you're actually doing more damage in the short and long term than you would be normally. But only because you're not increasing them. If you had pet bonuses from your equipment, or you decided to go into pets, this would be a totally different story. You don't want this to explode, because you're actually investing equipment and points into the Blight Fiend for it to specifically not die. Dying is just provides a damage bonus before it goes. But in a poison acid focused Cabalist, you're not usually going to be looking to use pets because none of the other pets do anything with poison acid damage. So having the Blight Fiends explode actually means, in the long run and in the short run, more damage. Just a higher damage output, especially since, again, you can combine this with Blood of Dreeg, especially the aspect of the Guardian, and they do even more poison acid damage. But you don't necessarily have to fully commit to this either. For example, like I said, you could pull out Blight Burst here, and then you have enough where you could get Ravenous Earth all the way if you really wanted Ravenous Earth, and the same applies specifically to Bloody Pox as well. You have your choice between Ravenous Earth and Bloody Pox. Now you may be asking, why don't I use both Ravenous Earth and Bloody Pox? Well, frankly, that is because they both kind of fulfill the similar purpose, but neither of them are quite as heavy on the poison acid damage as your self-destructive Blight Fiends. Now you may be wondering, Professor, why would it be okay to remove Blight Burst? Well, primarily because as powerful and as damaging as Blight Burst can be, and the potential to confuse your targets for up to 6 seconds is potentially quite useful, and they generate additional threat. The problem is that they only live for 12 seconds, and there's no 100% guarantee that they will even use Blight Burst in that period of time. Furthermore, because you're also not really spending any equipment or points into increasing the Blight Fiends, there's also the chance that they will die well before 12 seconds are up, so they might not even have the time to actively trigger their Blight Burst. The difference with Rotting Fumes is that this is just a passive aura around them. So, this, even if they die in 1 second, they still had that 1 second to afflict the enemy with Rotting Fumes for at least a little bit of time. So that's primarily why, I mean, is this incredibly powerful? It can be, yes. This can be quite useful, and I have seen even the unstable Blight Fiends do some pretty incredible things with Blight Burst. But just keep in mind that it's not necessarily guaranteed to... They're not guaranteed to have the time to trigger this, considering you're not doing any boosting of these. So it really comes down to your personal preference. Do you really want the Blight Burst here? And then you just put some points into Bloody Pox for the reduction to enemy health. Maybe you get to wasting for some offensive ability decrease. Maybe. Maybe you want to splash in Slail's Witchfire because your weapon is incredibly powerful. Now keep in mind, to some extent as well, this is also going to adjust to what equipment you have. Maybe you don't use the Blight Fiend at all and you run both Bloody Pox and Ravenous Earth because you happen to have equipment that boosts both of these. That's perfectly fine. But you have options here. But when you are running a Poison Acid Cabalist, you are generally going to be seeing Dreeg's Evil Eye as your primary damage source. Again, you don't necessarily have to. If you're not going to use Dreeg's Evil Eye as your primary damage source, you are going to be leaning more towards Ravenous Earth because this does have a mere 3-second recharge, which is why also, even if you went with Focused Gaze, this can still really work. But I usually prefer to just spam the Dreeg's Evil Eye, and my weapon just becomes a method of damaging, of boosting my damage with my skills. So if you treat basically your weapon as a second offhand, you can really hit very hard, or treat your weapon as an offhand and use a shield, which can also work. It really depends on where you want to go with it. The interesting thing about this combination is it's one of the few combinations that doesn't really place a heavy emphasis on any one particular weapon type. There is a mild preference for melee, specifically two-handed. If you're running pets, Harvester of Death is a really interesting, potentially useful thing to grab because this requires a two-handed melee weapon, and it really increases the damage of good old Bone Harvest a lot, and Bone Harvest is a really incredible skill for pets. And then you have Necrotic Edge, which has a sweep attack if it's melee, which it doesn't have if it's ranged. So other than a very mild emphasis on two-handed weapons and melee, you can really build whatever you want weapon-wise, and that's quite powerful. And even then, you don't necessarily need to be using a melee weapon to make Necrotic Edge useful. It all depends on how you play and how you run this. It's just a very mild preference, unlike a lot of other classes that really push some specific thing. For example, Soldier really pushes either two-handed weapons or shields. As an example, Oathkeeper really pushes shields in general. Arcanist pushes offhands pretty hard. There are skills you can't even use with the Arcanist if you don't have an offhand, etc. But this particular specific combination just does not care, and it's one of the few that doesn't. Similar to Demolitionist Occultist, that doesn't care about what you're equipped with either. But that's the Poison Acid build, and a couple of varieties that you can swing with that. And that's not often talked about, but it can be incredibly potent, especially since anything that resists Poison Acid doesn't usually resist Vitality that well, and vice versa. A great example is the Chthonics, who resist Vitality well enough, but they have, at best, mediocre resistance to Poison Acid, with certain rare exceptions. And there are specific enemy types, of course, that are just going to be resistant to Poison Acid. For example, the Blight Zombies, anything basically that does Poison Acid damage is probably going to be resistant to it. The Slith are overall really resistant to Poison Acid, which is a bit of a problem. The Bugs typically are. Things of that nature. The poisonous, spiny things, I can't remember what they're called off the top of my head, they're resistant to Poison Acid. You get the idea. But most enemies aren't going to resist both of these. Actually, there's very few enemies that resist both of these, and those are almost entirely heroes, bosses, and nemesis. So, with that being said, what about pets? Well, personally, this is just my preferred way of building pets. I like to go Master of Death, Skeletons, Summon Familiar, and sometimes I build that, I don't always build that. And I also really like Bone Harvest. I usually use Harvester of Death because that's a personal preference. I get to stay close to my skeletons. And then at this point, I'll run a couple of different things. I usually will run Call of the Grave, but not necessarily guaranteed. At this particular point, you really have to decide how much focus you want to put in on your pets. Do I want the Blight Fiend? I mean, it's very useful, but I don't necessarily need it. You could grab Spectral Binding to decrease the physical and vitality resistance of nearby enemies. If you're running melee with this build, this really works. If you're ranged, I wouldn't bother with this. Now, this build actually works really well with both melee and ranged. If you, mostly, well, I'm going to actually explain that first. I'm going to pull this out for a hot second. See, if you're playing melee, you're going to be wanting to spend some time on skills that will boost your skeletons, because you're going to be spending a decent amount of time with them. However, if I had to make a recommendation for this build, I would actually slightly recommend and lean towards ranged, for 2 reasons. First off, raised skeletons will randomly give you crossbowmen and mages. These are both ranged. Well, the mages are technically whatever, but they will cast spells from the farthest distance as they can, as far away as they can. And then as the enemy gets closer, they just don't usually move. But you have also crossbowmen, you have the mages, and you have your familiar. Alright, now the familiar is going to be boosting the elemental damage of everyone playing towards the back. Your crossbowmen, your mages, who are basically the ones that are supposed to be getting the benefits of Storm Spirit, especially the mages who generally do fire damage anyways. This is really nice. So by standing in the back with your crossbowmen, your mages, and your crow, you're getting this benefit as well. The crow also will heal you along with all of the ranged people, because Mend Flesh is an AoE, although it'll occasionally heal the front lines. It's more likely to emphasize healing you, for obvious reasons. They did a good job with the AI there. And you're going to have a slightly higher concentration of pets in the back line, because you're going to have your crow and yourself, plus whatever crossbowmen and mages you happen to have as well. And the melee skeletons will be acting as a really effective meat shield. So I tend to play a pet-focused Cabalist with ranged weapons. I have played it melee as well, but I usually prefer to play it ranged, for just this reason. Now, if you are going to play it ranged, you have a couple of different interesting options you can run. First off, you can go into Slael's Witchfire and Consecrated Blade. This really depends on how powerful your actual weapon is, and how important it is to your build. If your weapon is just there to basically boost pets more, I wouldn't bother with this. This probably isn't going to help you that much. But if your weapon actually does some pretty decent damage, or you build Reaping Strike, either because you have a piece of equipment that boosts this, or you just want to actually have something that you can use yourself that will cause you to do some legitimate damage at range, that's fine. Reaping Strike is great, and Slael's Witchfire can really boost that, and just attacking on Consecrated Blade just really helps. Just as an overall PSA, if you are building either Reaping Strike or Necrotic Edge, give at least some thought to building Slael's Witchfire, because this boosts your attack speed by a very impressive 15%, which means that you are more likely to trigger Reaping Strike and or Necrotic Edge simply by spam rather than by actually increasing the percentage. So give that some consideration. Another thing you can do at range is actually Bloody Pox, and this is actually something quite useful. And I'll talk about a couple of other options, because you've got a decreased offensive ability, which deals with accuracy, so your enemies are less accurate, which means your front line is living longer. And furthermore, they're going to become randomly confused, which gets your front line even more survivability, and the whole time it's doing damage, including percentage reduction damage, which is, of course, as I've always been saying, is very powerful. You additionally have actually the very interesting option of vulnerability, since you actually will have access to vitality and elemental damage at the very least, so the reduction to enemy vitality and elemental resistance is actually quite powerful with pets. And, of course, whether or not you have physical and bleeding doesn't really matter, because the skeletons have some physical, which is fantastic. So you do have Curse of Frailty and Vulnerability. Curse of Frailty and Vulnerability will work regardless, so will the idea of Slael's Witchfire plus Reaping Strike. Those are effective on both melee and ranged, but melee has a few more skill options, even though, technically speaking, there's a bit more concentration in the ranged. So there's no real advantage to one or the other. It really depends on how much you want to concentrate on your pets and how much you want to concentrate on yourself. If you are running melee, again, Bone Harvest is amazing. If you're ranged, this doesn't usually reach far enough. You're generally going to want to just stick to shooting, and that's why Reaping Strike is great there, because you get to heal from a distance, and you get to do extra damage from a distance. By the way, I forgot to mention, ranged or melee, Ravenous Earth is really good for your front line, again, because this first off reduces the enemy's damage by a percentage, and furthermore by a not insubstantial 20%, and furthermore it also reduces their resistances, which really helps your skeletons on the front line, and again, this is percentage reduction. This is something I build a little more often than Bloody Pox when I'm running pets, if I'm going to run ranged, because you can throw that out there and just have a really grand old time with this. Or you could just go into Blight Fiend, run the Rotting Fumes, which is an interesting alternative. Run the Rotting Fumes. Look, their defensive ability is down, which means they're dodging less. They are missing a certain percentage of their attacks. And, oh look, they're randomly getting confused. Now, in this particular instance, unlike the previous broad build that we were talking about with the Poison Acid, you're actually wanting your Blight Fiend to survive here, because this is actually, first off, pulling aggro away from your frontline skeletons, which is pretty important, especially since the Blight Fiend, if you look at it, has an absolute ton of health. That is 41,000 health. Yes, that's a lot of health. This thing is really intended to be a tank. So that's a quite interesting and powerful alternative to any of the other abilities or what have you. This is especially important if you're having a really hard time where your skeletons are dying too quick, or if you're even melee and you're dying too quick. The Blight Fiend with the Rotting Fumes with Blight Burst will help keep you alive, because it will be very actively pulling aggro and very actively decreasing the enemy's ability to both hit and dodge, which is very potent. Now, Call of the Grave, I see a lot of people talk about. It's nice, but it's not a need to have. I build it quite often just because I really like the boosted damage. But if I'm 100% focused on pets, and I am talking all of my points are in pets, consider this for a hot second. Hold on. Regardless of if you're melee or ranged, if you're devoting 100% of your points to pets, you will find you do not have a whole lot of points left over for yourself. Which is okay, but you have to be prepared for that reality. Now, this is... obviously, we would have more points here. Hold on one second. Now, obviously, you would have this many, and then what I usually will do, if I'm going 100% pets, 100% pets. Regardless of if you're melee or ranged, Sails Witchfire, Reaping Strike, and whatever else you want to put the points in is entirely up to you. Maybe you want to put in some summon to Consecrated Blade, which is what I usually do. You can clean that up, get that really nice and out there. You can actually, provide your pets with a little bit of extra chaos damage, which is nice. But this is what a 100% pet build looks like. Notice that I didn't put any points into the Hellhound. The primary reason for this is because the Hellhound, although it is somewhat impressive, doesn't really flow quite as well with the rest of the pets. There are a couple of reasons for this. First off, as discussed, the Crow will enhance the elemental damage of your crossbowmen and your skeleton mages. Your frontline will be quite coordinated with the frontline skeletons, having their aggro pulled away by the Blight Fiend. This will be tanking. Master of Death increases acid, vitality, and poison damage. You'll notice that Master of Death does not increase fire or chaos. Now, the Crow serves a double purpose of boosting the elemental damage of your other pets and healing them, so it doesn't matter that the Crow's damage is increasing. Whether or not it's increasing, you actually technically don't even need Lightning Strike if you wanted to instead go whole hog into Second Right for your own personal actual damage output. That's totally fine. It's a choice you can make, one or the other. I just really like the stun that Lightning Strike adds, but that's a personal preference. Second Right is an amazing pickup as well. It depends entirely on how much damage you personally want to be doing compared to your pets. But regardless of which one of those you choose, at least get Storm Spirit, because, again, Increased elemental damage, elemental resistance, beautiful. The heal, excellent, great, yay. But this isn't boosting fire and chaos, which is what the Hellhound does, primarily. And furthermore, it's so expensive of a pet to build because in order to actually get it to maximum effectiveness, which you would normally want in a pet build, you have to go all the way to the end of Occultist, when you can actually be pulling that 25 points out and putting them elsewhere. For example, keeping you alive through a combination of Slail's Witchfire and Reaping Strike, which is primarily how you're going to be keeping yourself alive throughout the fight if your crow doesn't feel like healing you, because the crow isn't consistent in its healing. It's just a fact you have to face with the crow. So, on top of all of that, if you did decide to go into the Hellhound, Hellfire does not do you as much good, because this is only increasing fire and chaos damage, and while your skeletons will benefit to some extent from the fire damage with their elemental damage increase in Will of the Crypt, nothing here does chaos damage, unless you are specifically building Consecrated Blade, and even then, that's not necessarily a ton of chaos damage. It's 20 flat plus 45% of their physical damage. Their physical damage is 60, so you're looking at about 25 extra chaos damage. So that winds up being 45 or so chaos damage, excluding any items or effects you're building here. And that chaos damage is not massively increased. It's increased by 50% here. It's just, honestly, the Hellhound I have never seen really be worth it, except in very rare specific builds using specific items. But we'll be dealing with those in a future video, so we're going to leave aside those items for now. But for general purposes, if you're just either experimenting or you don't have the items or what have you, you just want to improv this build for fun, because improving is a blast, I love improving, then you really don't want to go into the Hellhound. It's way too inconsistently useful compared to a lot of other pets that you have, to compare to the rest of the pets in combination. So this would be what a full 100% pet build looks like. You do have a couple of other options. If you decided not to go into the Blight Fiend, you want to do at least some damage yourself, you could go into Ravenous Earth to help your front line. Whether or not you're in the front line, you could go into Bone Harvest if you really wanted to. You've got all kinds of options. You can mix and match your pets and your personal skills as you feel. You could just go Bone Harvest, Skeletons, Blight Fiend, and not even do the Familiar, because you just want to as much frontline as possible and just boost everyone through Bone Harvest. That's perfectly acceptable. But even with a full pet build, Call of the Grave mostly is an enhancement to you, and in a full pet build, that's not a whole lot. There's not a whole lot of stuff that you're going to be enhancing with this. Yes, your pets will get some benefit, but Call of the Grave is primarily intended to boost you. And in a full pet build, you're really not seeing that. You're not going to see a lot of returns on that. Call of the Grave is really effective primarily for mixed builds there, where you have some pet focus and you've got some personal focus. But for a 100% pet build, I don't build that. It's just not worth it in the long run. I often will not even build it in a no pet build, because again, there are better ways of increasing your damage output than Call of the Grave, in terms of, I could grab Spectral Wrath instead, decreasing the enemy's physical vitality and Aether resistance as an example. So if you are running, if you're running a melee pet or hybrid pet build, Spectral Binding and Spectral Wrath are always an interesting potential pickup as well. But you basically, if you're going hybrid, I would say pick 2 of your favorite skills that you really want to run, and then the rest of it should be pets, broadly speaking, because you're not really going to go wrong with that, even though Master of Death problematically doesn't really enhance you. There's some offensive ability and defensive ability increases, whoopee. It's not a whole lot, as you'll notice. The offensive ability is a percentage, which is nice, and the vitality resistance is nice, but, But that's a couple of ideas on pet builds, and again, you can mix and match that as you please. Absolutely feel free. And you'll also notice, by the way, I actually didn't mention this, but I didn't go into Bonds Abyssmial. Again, this is just very expensive to get to, in my personal opinion. If you really want to stretch for that, that's fine. You would have to essentially sacrifice Slail's Witchfire and Reaping Strike to do that, though. And that becomes then, again, it comes down to a personal choice. It is an option. If you want to go really dedicated 100% pet build, you don't build Slail's Witchfire, you don't build Reaping Strike, and you actually don't go Master of Death. You pull this back here, and you go into Bonds of Bismeal and Manipulation, or you just drop out Lightning Strike and get at least Bonds of Bismeal and some of Manipulation. It's just such a stretch actually putting 100 points into, or 50 points into both of these, 100 points total. That becomes very expensive. Not a whole lot of builds do that for a reason. But you can. Again, there's not a whole lot of wrong ways you can build the Cabalist. It all works together so beautifully. It is one of the easiest combinations to improv, because basically everything works. The only thing that I think is technically easier is a shield-toting Demolitionist Oathkeeper combination. Beyond that, this is the easiest thing you can improv. It has more variety, of course, than Demolitionist Oathkeeper, so it's often more fun to improv than Demo Oath, but this is excellent for that reason. Now, before I close out this this analysis, this examination, so to speak, I do want to talk about vitality focuses, because basically, when you're running a vitality-centric Cabalist, you've got two options. You have the offensive and the defensive option. Now, interestingly enough, the Harbinger of Souls is the more aggressive option. Your attack damage is being converted to health, you do not get any damage absorption at all, your attack and casting speed are increasing, and you're getting substantial increases in your damage to vitality and aether damage as you level this up. This is the aggressive option. This is the version where you run it in there, and you are trying to kill them and heal off of them before they can kill you through your healing. Now, if you're going to run this, as long as you're not running any pets, you can build whatever else you want, and it will work. Except maybe Bone Harvest. I don't usually build Bone Harvest if I don't have pets. I just don't really like using Soul Harvest without pets. Also, there's such a high amount of cold and frostburn damage on this whole thing that often I don't necessarily want that. Because the interesting thing about specifically Harbinger of Souls, but this broadly applies to the offensive or defensive version, the possession version, by the way, where you use possession instead of Harbinger of Souls. That's the defensive version because of the damage absorption. But anyways, these two broad build types of offensive vitality or defensive vitality offer enough diversity of damage that you often don't need the extra diversity that Bone Harvest provides with its cold and pierce damage, because for Harbinger of Souls you have vitality and aether. Vitality is really good against ethereals. The aether damage is really good against chthonics. So, while normally vitality-focused builds would have a problem with chthonics, Harbinger of Souls-focused Cabalists don't, because they have the aether damage to fall back on. Because obviously if you're building Harbinger of Souls, you're probably looking to build Drain Essence, which does both of those, which is great. You're probably looking into Ravenous Earth, which does vitality and aether, as well as some poison and acid for some extra splashing of that. You're probably looking at Spectral Binding, which decreases resistances to both of those, which everyone loves. And then from here you can pull whatever you want. Bloody Pox, if you really wanted to. Bloody Pox is great. Doombolts, although not often do I build Doombolt in a Harbinger of Souls focus. Maybe you want extra poison damage. Maybe you want Drieg's Evil Eye instead of Ravenous Earth. That's perfectly fine. You know, you've got a lot of options. But if you're going to go with a aggressive vitality build focused around Harbinger of Souls, I do recommend Drain Essence and Spectral Binding / Spectral Wrath, but I do want to warn you with Drain Essence. When you start building Hungering Reach, it's going to seem like it got weaker. It isn't, but because Drain Essence is increasing damage, and Decomposition is increasing damage, but Hungering Reach is only increasing crit damage, you're not going to really see a whole lot of damage benefits to Hungering Reach. And that's okay. Hungering Reach is really about potentially wiping out multiple enemies, and although I'm not a huge fan of this personally, sometimes it'll save your life. You don't have to put a whole bunch of points in Hungering Reach if you don't want to. Just put in as many as you need for Decomposition, because Decomposition is actually really impressive. But generally speaking, you're going to want Drain Essence. Maybe you want Reaping Strike, maybe you don't. That's up to you. If you do, at least, consider Slayer's Witchfire. That is vitality damage right there. Especially if you go with the second right, that's even more vitality damage, and some resistance, which is nice, because then you can really stack up some much-needed protections, considering Harbinger of Souls has none. So, you've got some options there, but these, for Harbinger of Souls, not necessarily this, but at the very least, these three are highly useful for that. But what if you want to go with Possession? Possession is a bit more defensive. Again, you do have the damage absorption, which really helps. That's primarily why it's more defensive. Basically, the only difference here is you're a little tankier, but you're not healing damage off of... You're not healing from the damage you're doing, so there's less emphasis on necessarily overwhelming the enemy with pure damage. You can actually kind of go for a longer fight if you really want to. You're not locked into a do-or-die kind of fighting. Well, you're not leaning towards a do-or-die fighting style, I should be properly saying. But with this, again, you can go Dreeg's Evil Eye, you can go Soleil's Witchfire, Sickle of Consumption, all of these abilities here. Bloody Pox, that's great. Blood of Dreeg, you've got all these great options. You can pull anything from here as well pretty effectively, even Spectral Binding if you really wanted to. But what I would warn you is, if you're running Possession, I would veer away from Drain Essence, which is, you're only boosting that Vitality damage, and veer towards Sickle of Consumption. Now, there's very specific reasons for this. Okay, again, barring items, which I'm assuming you don't have, or maybe you just want a full improv and you're not going to touch your items. Under the effects of Harbinger of Souls is boosting both Vitality and Aether, meaning that Drain Essence, all of its damage is being boosted, both at the Drain Essence point and also at the Decomposition point. That's fantastic. This means that even in its low point of Hungering Reach, Drain Essence is being boosted and is healing you more. Great. Sickle of Consumption does Vitality and Chaos damage later on in Destruction, and some mild fire damage. But you're not boosting the fire or the chaos damage with Harbinger of Souls. So if you're looking at it from a point of healing, Drain Essence is more likely to be useful to you under Harbinger of Souls, and because Possession increases Vitality and Chaos, Sickle of Consumption with Destruction is more likely to heal you more under that. Again, this depends on what items you have, but that's the general rule with Vitality Cabalists. But beyond that specific warning about the skills that are healing you, you're pretty much free to mix and match anything that does Vitality damage, and picking the secondary damage options that you feel are the most effective. Now keep in mind that if you go with a Possession focus, you may want to look more towards Poison Acid as an alternative damage type rather than Aether, because first off, Possession is increasing that, and second off, again, Poison Acid gets around a lot of things that are resistant to the Vitality. But do keep that in mind. And as a closing out of this particular video, just remember that there's really no wrong way to build this. Hybrid pets, full pets, no pets, there's nothing really wrong you can do. By the way, I never mentioned Reap Spirit, but the Wraith here only lives for 18 seconds, so even under a full pet build, I often find this not really being worth it, personally. If I'm going full pets, I want my Wraith to survive. I don't want it to keel over. This is actually more effective under Harbinger of Souls, in my opinion, than under Master of Death, because you're actually doing an ability-based damage thing with the Reap Spirit, and the Wraith is kind of a happy bonus after the fact, you know what I'm saying? So, I didn't actually talk about that, but I wanted to really quick. Reap Spirit, in my opinion, is a little bit more effective under Harbinger of Souls than under Master of Death. But that's just me. If you have a different opinion, please share it. I would love to see your perspective on the Wraith, the Sundered Wraith, or on the class in general. I love this class combination. Like I said, I'm really fond of improving or improvising builds, using only those items that I find during the playthrough. And this is one of my favorites to improv. Just because of the sheer diversity of builds that I can run with this at any given time, and how freely you can swap out skills and remain 100% effective. Because none of these do badly in this combination. Everything here is essentially interchangeable and equally as effective with each other. Approach this combination with no fear. You cannot mess this up. It's one of the few class combinations I will straight up say, you can't mess this up. The first was Demo Oathkeeper. I will actually argue the first was technically Soldier Oathkeeper. The second was Demo Oathkeeper, and this is the third. This is a foolproof combination. No matter what you do or how you build, this will be effective. I will mention, very briefly, that it is not quite as effective in the Shattered Realm, though, as a lot of other classes, because this is one of the extremely few combinations that does not have any consistent method of boosting movement speed. Any movement speed boosts have to be artificial. Pretty much every other combination boosts its movement speed or has a dash. Soldier has a dash. Oathkeeper has a dash. Demolitionist has an aura that increases its move speed. The heal on the Inquisitor and the heal on the Nightblade both increase move speed. The Arcanist is also slow, so there are certain Arcanist combinations that also have this problem. But we'll get to those in the future. But you've got a whole bunch of things. The Shaman is technically fairly slow as well. But again, we'll get to the Shaman. But that is the Cabalist. It is one of my favorite class combinations to improv. Improv. So if you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, opinions, viewpoints on this class, please share them in the comment section below. I love talking about it. Thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.